ask you a few questions. So, first of all, a show of hands. Do you prefer to have time zones enabled on your sites? We've got 1, yes, 2, no, 3, it depends on the site, or 4, I don't really think about it. So, who's 1? Okay, 2, 3, okay, 4. All right, interesting. So there's a bit of a mixture, but quite a lot of us don't really think about it. I mean, to be honest, I didn't really for quite a long time. Secondly, have you ever seen this warning? My date time received a naive date time while time zone support is active. Who's seen that? Who's kind of ignored it a bit when they saw it? Just like, I've seen that a lot. Okay, a little fact question now. In Django, is time zone support enabled by default? Yes, no, I have no idea, or none of the above. Who's number 1? Yes. Okay, who's 2? Who's 3? No idea. Who's 4? Well, the correct answer is actually 4, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So time zones are something that I think we would rather not think about, but I'm going to force you to, just for about 15 minutes, and hopefully at the end of it, we will not have to think about it very much ever again. So in this talk, first of all, I'm going to talk about the time zone settings in Django. Then I'm going to give you a little introduction as to naive versus aware time zones, or date times, sorry. And then finally, I'm going to look at how Django handles date times in models, forms, and templates. And there is a little bit of a bonus quiz coming up at the end, so pay attention. Time zone settings. So there are only really 2 time zone settings that you really need to worry about. There's the use TZ setting, and there's the time zone setting. There's not much to it, really. Use TZ enables time zone support on Django, and time zone sets the default time zone. This would be my suggestion as to what you want your settings to be if you're starting a Django project. Now, this brings us to the question of whether on... hold on a sec, I'll take a question in a sec. So this brings us to the question of whether or not time zones are enabled by default. So can anyone think why it might be yes or no? It's a bit of a complicated answer to the question. Any guesses? Yeah? A good question, but it's not that. Basically, it is not enabled by default. Time zones are disabled by default in Django, which is kind of surprising. But if you start your project with start project, then it will enable them by default. So it really depends on how you started your project. So it's worth checking because they are disabled by default. And there is some evidence that I wrote in. That was part 1. Part 2, a bit longer, we're going to talk about naive and aware date times. So let me introduce you to a naive date time. 12th of April 2016, 7:30 p.m. 10 minutes off. So what can we say about this? Does anyone have anything to say about this? It doesn't have a time zone, that's right. So it's a naive date time because it doesn't have a time zone. What else can we say about it as a kind of concept? There's no seconds. Yeah, that's true. There's no microseconds. To be honest, I kind of just left that off, but you're right. No location. Yeah, that's good. Like more specifically, coming on from what you said, doesn't actually refer to a time, like a moment in time, because this could be experienced at various different times by different people. So, for example, it's 7:30 now here, but it's not 7:30 now in Paris. It's going to be 7:30 in an hour. So if you want to, say, record a date time, and you want to record something happening at an actual moment in time, maybe a naive date time isn't a very good way to store that, because it's a very subjective thing. Now, Django has the ability to tell whether things are naive or aware, We can get a naive datetime by doing datetime now, for example. That datetime now will always return a naive datetime, regardless of Django settings. We've also got Django.util's timezone package, which gives you loads of different features, one of which is you can find out whether it's a naive with timezone.isNaive. Pretty simple. Now, these are aware date times. So we have 12th of April 2016, 7:30 London time, 12th of April 2016, 6:30 p.m. UTC, which is the same as GMT. And we have 12th of April 2016, 8:30 p.m. Paris time. So any comments on those? They're all the same. Who said that? Yeah, they are all the same moment in time. Obviously, there's sort of a bit of local information about them as to how we might want to present them, maybe, but these are basically the same thing. And if you were to compare these in Django, it would say they were equal if you were to do an equality operation. So aware date times are very different for naive date times. It's easy to think of them as being the same, but they actually properly represent a moment in time as a concept. Just to show you, there's also a way of finding out whether a time zone is a date time is aware. We can use Django.utils.timezone, and if used TZ is true, then it will return an aware date time if you call timezone.now. You see that by default it's returning a UTC date time. I think it will always do that, regardless of what your time zone setting says. It will prefer UTC times. But that doesn't matter because it's a moment in time. It doesn't matter what the time zone is, really. It just matters that we have a time zone. And we also have timezone.isAware. You can find out that it's aware if you want to. Now, what happens if you've got a naive time zone, date time, and you want to make it aware? Well, we've got the timezone.makeAware function, which is pretty simple. You pass it a naive date time and you get an aware date time. But if you do this, you need to be careful about what you're doing because there isn't as much information in a naive date time as in an aware date time. So what Django does is it assumes that your naive date time is in the current time zone, which usually is the default time zone. And then it will put that information in and then it will go, okay, great. Here is a naive date time for 7:30. I'm going to assume it's London time. So I'll now convert it, and you can see now we've got an aware date time which has the time zone information of London time in there. But it's the same hour and minute and stuff. Does that make sense? So that's quite an important concept to clock, is when you convert naive times to date times to aware date times, it's using the current time zone as an assumption. And just a quick word on the current versus the default time zone. The default time zone is what you define in your time zone setting. The current time zone is if you want to do something clever in your app which sets the time zone as something else. An example might be if you want users to be able to configure their own preferred time zone on their profile, say, and then you might want to have a piece of middleware that loads their time zone as being the current time zone before serving any requests. That's one way of doing things. But all you do is you activate the time zone using the time zone library and also this other library called PYTZ. I don't know how to pronounce that. PyTZ or something. Which actually Django suggests you should install whenever you're using time zones. Does that make sense? Current versus default time zone. Yeah. Final word on all this naive and aware stuff is dates and times. Dates and times are always naive as far as Django is concerned. They're just calendar events. They're not aware of time zones at all. And like I have fallen into the trap before of thinking, oh well, a date plus a time equals a date time, but it actually doesn't. really. I've before split up my date and time into a date field and a time field on a model once, and that just didn't work because Django didn't handle the time zone correctly. So if you use date times, then use a date time field. Yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh dear, I didn't know I had a time limit. Okay, part 3, I better hurry up then. Date times in models, forms and templates. So this is, if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this. This is the life cycle of how Django will handle a time zone or a date time. So first of all, the user will submit a naive date time in the form. Django will then convert, it will then assume that date time is in the current time zone for the user, whatever it is. So in this case, Europe, London. Then the next step is it converts it to UTC. Django loves UTC, which is like GMT. So it will convert it to that. And then when you save it, it will save it in the database as UTC. Django always stores all its date times as UTC in the database. Remember that. Finally, if you want to see it later, it will pull it out of the database. It will still be in UTC, and only at render time will it convert it to whatever the user's current date time is. So we see how 7:30 went to 6:30, but 6:30 UTC, and then it comes back to 7:30 at the end. So all you really need to remember is user inputted date times are assumed to be in the current time zone. Then date times are stored in the database as UTC, and then date times are rendered in templates in the current time zone. A quiz. I've been looking forward to this. So let's assume that our app is in British summertime and that time zone is set to Europe, London. So basically, imagine it's today. Okay, so question 1. With time zones disabled, you save to a model field a date time of 7:30 p.m. today. Now, you render the model field to a template. So what time do you see? 6:30 we've got. Who thinks 6:30? Yeah? Anyone else? 7:30? Okay, well, the correct answer to this is 7:30. The reason is because time zone support is disabled. So Django just treats everything naively. So it will take it, it will store it in the database as 7:30, and then it will output it as 7:30. There's no time zone handling. So question 2. Now, we've still got this in the database as 7:30. We're going to enable time zone support. And then we're going to refresh the page so we see the date time again. Now, what time do we see? Okay, so some people are saying 7:30, some people are saying 8:30. 8:30 is correct. Can anyone explain why? Who said 8:30? Yeah, so it's stored UTC as 7:30 in the database. So we've got this 7:30 UTC assumed date, and then it's like, oh, 7:30 UTC, add British summertime, 8:30. That's a warning about enabling time zones. Okay, question 3. Resave the model with 7:30 today, London time. So we've got time zones enabled now, and we're resaving it, and we're rendering it again. What does it look like? Anyone think differently? No, you're right. Thank God. Okay, question 4. So now we're going to resave the model with 7:30 today, Paris time. So we've generated a different date time object somehow, made it Paris time, and then we've saved it. And now we're rendering it. What do we see? 6:30. Correct. You're getting it. This is great. So it's 6:30 p.m. today. Does anyone not know why? Yeah, so we're assuming that time zone is Europe, London.
But if I'm a client in New York and I say something from my current time, what is it saying
It will.
as in UK?
So that's a really good question. And basically, Django will just assume that any visitors from anywhere in the world will be in the default time zone, Europe, London. However, if you want to write your own code to handle working out what time zone someone's in, you can set the current time zone for your users. But if you're not doing that, then it will just assume that they're Europe-London time zone. Does that make sense? Final question. So save the model with 7:30 p.m. today, London time. So right now, oh yes, look at that. Now, turn off time zone support and reload the model. What do we see? So let's think about it. So we've saved it in the database, 7:30 London time. That will be converted to UTC in the database. So it's 6:30 UTC in the database. When we turn off time zone support, it will be reloaded as a naive date time as 6:30. So the answer is 6:30. So we can see that if you change time zone settings, you need to do a migration as well. And I'm not going to go into exactly how, but hopefully that's a warning that you can't just mess around with that setting. You'll need to make some decisions about what's in the database and then convert them correctly to the right time zone before resaving them. So this is a little table I made. I don't have time to talk through it all, but the one thing I'm going to show you is the top right-hand corner, which is if you give a naive date time, you try and store it in the database, and use TZ is true, then you get the warning that we saw at the beginning of the talk. So that's the specific time when you get that warning. I'll flick that back up so you can have a look and answer any questions. But my closing remarks are, number one, I haven't really talked about it, but use PYTZ. It's just install it. That's all you have to do. You should, I think, always enable time zone handling. Maybe if anyone's got a use case for not enabling it, then we can have that in the questions. Don't enable or disable time zones without migrating your date times. Use timezone.now, never datetime.now. Timezone.now works even with time zone support disabled, and then it will just return naive date times. Finally, use Django.timezone.utils for helpful utilities. So that's the end. I'm actually just going to put that back up there just in case people want to look a bit more. But any questions? Yes, anyone didn't hear. The first thing was if you want to get an aware date time, you can do datetime.utc now as well. That's an option. And secondly, there's a third-party library called Arrow, which is great for working with date times, specifically parsing strings. Any other questions? Yes, Adam. PyTZ up to date. Yes, at the back. Repeat the question. Someone has disagreed with the previous comment. Datetime.utc now is a naive date time, but in UTC. Yes. Just does it. I don't know, actually.
They need to be kept up to date.
I don't know. Anyone know? Why? Questions? Do we ever need to think about time zones again? Maybe just a little bit, but not too much. Cool. Thank you, everyone.